Have video game controllers peaked? Take the Series X controller for example, it's almost identical to the Xbox One, which is only slightly different to the 360 controller. And it's not just Xbox, sure the PlayStation 5 controller looks different to the original DualShock, but only on the outside. The controllers are mostly identical despite them being 25 years apart. I mean, you could pretty much play any modern console game on this controller from 1997. And so in this video we're going to take a look back through the history of video game controllers to try and figure out how they evolved into their latest iteration and if there's anywhere left for them to go. Okay, we start with Pong, the first video game and thereby the first set of controls. Well, it was just a simple dial to move the square up and down back then. That same year saw the release of the Magnavox Odyssey, the first home console and the first controller. There were no buttons yet, just a couple of dials to let you navigate directions. There were 3 directions: vertical, horizontal, and English, my favorite of all directions. A few years later, Atari would release the 2600. Now this controller was a real game changer. Not only did it have a directional stick, it also had an action button. The next few years saw several other experimental designs, such as the Commodore 64 joystick, the Vectrex controller, and the ColecoVision dial pad. I'm pretty sure I remember seeing Gordon Gekko use that one in the movie. Around this time, arcade machines really started to take off, and most would utilize a directional pad with a couple of buttons. In 1983, Nintendo took the control schemes from their arcade machines and adapted them to their first home console, the Famicom, or the NES as it's known outside of Japan. And so Nintendo created the first contemporary game controller. It had a D-pad, 2 action buttons, and a start and select button. Yes, it's not exactly ergonomic compared to today's standards, but every controller that came after can trace its DNA back to the NES. For example, here we have Sega's Master System controller. However, Sega did more than just copy Nintendo, because in 1988 it would release the Genesis Mega Drive. Not only did this controller have 3 face buttons, it was also the first mainstream controller to have an ergonomic design. Nintendo would answer with the the Super Nintendo controller. Sure, its design wasn't as form-fitting as the Mega Drive, but at least it no longer had the dimensions of a brick. Nintendo were also focused on expanding the controls, as games were starting to become more sophisticated like Link to the Past and Final Fantasy IV. And so Nintendo would one-up Sega with 4 face buttons alongside introducing the shoulder buttons. Of course, Sega weren't going to let that slide, so in 1993 they introduced the second generation Mega Drive controller. This one with a whopping 6 face buttons, and for some reason a single shoulder button on the right side. Oh, and this controller was also redesigned to look less like a croissant. Now, I'm not going to be covering every third-party peripheral and PC controller, mainly because there are just too many to cover in one video. That, and most of them were just rip-offs of established designs, but it is worth noting that around this time the industry was going through its first boom of gimmick controllers. And some notable examples include the Konami Laserscope for the Charles Xavier fans, the Sega Aviator for the Tom Cruise fans, the SG Megastar for those who want their gamepad to look like an offshore oil rig, and the Activator for those who prefer to flail their arms around instead of pressing those cumbersome buttons. Moving into the mid-90s, Sony's failed partnership with Nintendo resulted in them entering the market on their own with the PlayStation. Now, the later incarnations of Sony's controllers would very much take on an iconic form factor of their own, but Nintendo's influence is very evident in this original controller launched back in 1994. It's pretty much the Super Nintendo pad with longer handles and 2 extra shoulder buttons. That same year, Sega would release the Saturn with a controller that was almost identical to its predecessor. Meanwhile, Nintendo were working on something special. They had seen the future, and it was virtual reality, 3D graphics. Now, the Nintendo 64 controller has gone on to have a bit of a mixed legacy due to its 3-handle design, but it was the first mainstream controller controller to use an analog stick. You see, Nintendo realized the industry was going to transition to 3D graphics. The D-pad worked great for 2D games, but system sellers like Super Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time would need an analog stick to properly navigate their vast three-dimensional levels. The other manufacturers realized Nintendo were onto something, and they quickly brought in an analog version revision of their controllers to the market. Sony did the old Sega trick of trying to one-up Nintendo and added not one but two analog sticks. Sega would also release an analog version of the Saturn controller, which wasn't as iconic, at least not in this iteration. In 1997, Sony and Nintendo would both introduce a vibration feature to their controllers. Nintendo went with the add-on approach, while Sony incorporated it into their DualShock controller. By the late 90s, 3D games have taken over the industry, and it was time for the next generation of consoles. Sega were the first ones out the gate with the Dreamcast. The controller, just like the console, has built up a strong cult following in the years since its untimely passing. Many people will tell you that it's one of the best controller designs ever, but what a lot of them don't realize is that the Dreamcast was just a slightly more chiseled Saturn 3D controller, demonstrated here by classic Game Room in his video. Sega also left out the second analog stick, instead focusing on the VMU, a juiced up memory card which also allowed you to play mini games and worked as a second screen when docked. It was definitely ahead of its time. Meanwhile, Sony would release the DualShock 2. Now, they had tinkered so much with their controller already in the previous generation that there was really no need for a big overhaul this time around. This controller was almost identical to its predecessor apart from pressure-sensitive buttons and improved vibration. As for Nintendo, they had learned their lesson with the N64 and decided to replicate the SNES's strategy and go for refinement instead of innovation. Rumble, pressure-sensitive buttons, dual analog sticks, the GameCube controller had everything customers would expect from a new console in 2001. However, it does seem like Nintendo were dragged somewhat reluctantly into the dual analog sphere. In an attempt to avoid completely replicating Sony's design, they staggered the two analog sticks and placed octagonal corners on the C-stick. But perhaps the most memorable thing about this controller's design is the face button layout. Nintendo moved away from the conventional layout, instead shoving a giant A button in the center with the other buttons orbiting it. And while this wouldn't be a standard feature, Nintendo also pioneered the wireless controller with the Wavebird, something its competitors would incorporate as standard in the next generation. And finally, Microsoft entered the race with the Xbox and its absolute unit of a controller, the Duke. Proportions aside, this was a very competent controller for the time. It was similar to the Dreamcast in layout, only with a second analog stick. Now, a year later, the Duke would be replaced with a slimmer, more form-fitting iteration referred to as the S-type controller. And this would be the first generation where it felt like the controller standard had formed. Manufacturers had stopped experimenting and all agreed on a more or less singular, consistent layout. Two analog sticks, one for movement, one for camera, about 6 face buttons, and at least 2 triggers for the flourishing shooter genre. The Xbox 360 controller, released in 2005, had slightly rounder edges and wireless connectivity, but apart from that, it was almost identical to its last generation predecessor. After 2 decades, it seemed like video game controllers had finally been perfected. And then Nintendo released the Wii. Driven by 2 generations of disappointing sales, Nintendo decided to try something new: motion controls. Some early design sketches show Nintendo experimenting with a conventional controller that literally broke in two. That most likely ended up being both too expensive and prone to breaking in the hands of children. So they decided to go with 2 separate controllers connected by a cord. And when you look past the novelty of the motion controls, you will still see a lot of classic Nintendo design cues. The Wiimote on its side resembles the original NES layout. GameCube's Big A is still there, albeit albeit a bit more sleeker, and the back of the nunchuck looks an awful lot like N64's middle handle. At its core, the Wii still stuck to the controller standard established in the past generations, which is evident by the classic controller released alongside the console, which sort of resembles a Super Nintendo controller with nipples, analog sticks. As for Sony, well, they flirted around with the idea of redesigning the PS3 controller, but decided that if it wasn't broken, then it didn't need fixing, only to break the controller by removing vibration in favor of the one gimmick they decided to afford themselves in that generation, 6-axis motion controls. You know, for people who are just fed up with using their thumbs. Sony would quickly realize the error of their ways and release the DualShock 3 the following year, by which point the industry was deep in the throes of waggle fever, and in typical Sony fashion, they decided to outdo Nintendo by copying and adding more features, which is how we ended up with the PlayStation Move controllers. The Move had full 3D motion tracking and the controllers were wireless, but it still failed to catch the Wii. Meanwhile, someone at Microsoft must have found an old Sega activator in a dumpster and decided to use that as the base for their entry in the motion controller race. Around this time, the industry was also going through its second gimmick controller boom. Once again, some notable examples include the Katana controller, the chainsaw, the bongos, the maracas, the Phantasy Star keyboard, the Steel Battalion tank thing, the Wii balance board, the Wii helmet, the Wii fishing rod, and the slew of music peripherals made popular by Guitar Hero and Rock Band games. However, my favorite has to be this, the Wii bowling ball. What could go wrong with literally throwing a bowling ball at your brand new TV? Luckily, by the early 2010s, the industry had started to recover from its heavy case of waggle fever. Nintendo, influenced by the growing popularity of tablet devices, decided to incorporate one into the Wii U's controller. The controller would act as a second screen when playing the game on the TV, or alternatively act as a main screen if you didn't have a TV because you'd smashed it playing with that big bowling ball. But if you take out the tablet gimmick, the Wii U controller seems very much like a Wii Classic controller with the analog sticks on its forehead. A Pro controller was also released, and once again Nintendo really didn't want to seem like they were copying the establishment, so they just swapped the right analog stick and the face buttons around. The other two console manufacturers decided to spend this generation refining their controllers. Microsoft continued to ever so slightly improve its controller, and after 3 generations, Sony finally decided to redesign theirs. Well, when I say redesign, I mean just slightly stretch it, as customers were complaining that the parallel analog sticks designed back in 1997 were too close for modern games with dynamic cameras. Sony would decide to use the newfound real estate in the middle for this generation's gimmick, the touchpad. And speaking of touchpads, an honorary shout out to the Steam controller released around that time. It was Valve's attempt to solve the mouse and keyboard problem for traditional controllers. It was definitely the most customizable controller of the era, and even though Valve discontinued it in 2019, it seemed to have developed quite a cult following. And so we come to the latest generation of controllers. Xbox, well, you can hardly tell the difference. I guess Microsoft have decided that they've perfected the video game controller, and a lot of people tend to agree. Sony redesigned the ergonomics of their controller for the PlayStation 5, but the layout remains identical. Look, I like the DualSense, but sometimes I wonder if Sony felt compelled to redesign it just to have something new. And this generation's gimmick is haptic feedback, which I actually think is great when used properly. I just wish more games would take full advantage of it. As for Nintendo, just like the SNES to the NES and the GameCube to the N64, the Switch seems like a refinement of the ideas introduced with the Wii U. And thankfully, Nintendo have moved the face buttons back in the right place on both the Joy-Cons and the Pro controller, resulting in this being the first generation where all the major players have more or less the same controller layout. Which is what brought me to this question in the first place: have video game controllers peaked? peaked? Well, kind of, at least for now. You see, we've been in the 3D graphics era of gaming for almost 3 decades, and in that time, manufacturers have been able to refine the best control set for these types of games. To be honest, we probably refined it around the time of the Xbox 360, but the Wii took us down a slight diversion. So yes, I think video game controllers have peaked when it comes to traditional 3D graphics-based games, but that doesn't mean these are the only types of games we will ever have. Controllers have always adapted with the way we experience games. You only needed a single dial for Pong because you could only move up and down. Likewise, there was no need for 2 analog sticks and triggers for Super Mario because all they did was run, jump, and shoot fireballs. And just like we transitioned from 2D to 3D in the 90s, we may soon be transitioning to another medium. Maybe it's VR or AR or something completely different. This is why I didn't cover all the various VR controllers in this video, as I feel they're still in their early formative stages. They're only just starting to move away from repurposing traditional game controllers and actually creating bespoke controllers like we've seen in the second iteration of PlayStation VR. I guess only time will tell if this is the next leap for video games or simply another bout of waggle fever for the industry. But please let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think video game controllers have peaked? And which is your favorite controller ever made? I'm just kidding, we all know it's the Dragon Quest Slime. As always, thanks for watching. Please consider supporting me on Patreon, and a big thanks to all of my existing patrons. Also, if you've enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.